Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
The events that became known as the Iran hostage crisis caused economic, domestic, military, and diplomatic conflicts between the two countries and internally within the United States, ranging from questioned presidential leadership to the failed rescue mission that doomed the Carter administration and ushered in the Reagan era. On November the 4th, 1979, hundreds of Islamic students occupied the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, taking the diplomats hostage and beginning a siege which would topple a president and compel us all to recognize a revolutionary new force, radical Islam. For Americans and Iranians, one man stood in the center of the crisis, Mohammad Reza Shah, King of Kings, for over 3 decades the absolute ruler of Iran.
One remembered that the U.S. had put the Shah back in power. All right, that was number one. Number two, the Shah was a very good friend of the United States. We considered him one of our strongest allies. He was sort of the way to keep peace and stability in the Middle East.
The Shah contributed to the crisis by refusing to follow the Constitution of Iran and having strong relations with the West. In 1963, he officially started the White Revolution, a program to westernize Iran. The Islamic calendar and clothing were modernized. During the changes that the Shah was making, a high-ranked Islamic leader, Ruhollah Ayatollah Khomeini, led protests and started the revolution against the Shah. The Ayatollah and the Shah debated over how the country of Iran should be run, and they had very different opinions. In the early 1960s, the Ayatollah Khomeini was arrested twice for his opposition towards the Shah's belief. He was exiled in Iraq for 14 years. During those 14 years, the Ayatollah students smuggled his plans and sermons for the revolution. He was forced out of Iraq in 1978, but refused to return to Iran until the Shah left. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran, seeking medical treatment for his spreading lymphatic cancer. 2 weeks later, the Ayatollah returned to Iran and was happily welcomed by a crowd of about 3 million. Because of his beliefs, the Ayatollah became the leader of the Islamic Revolution. It was known that the Shah was going to the United States for medical treatment, so in September 1979, the plan to seize the embassy started. It was originally planned by a group called the Muslim Student Followers of the Imam's Line. The original plan was to occupy the embassy for a few hours to announce their objection to the United States, then hold the hostages for no longer than a week and demand the return of the Shah to be tried and executed.
Hundreds of thousands of people were chanting out in front of the American embassy because they wanted the Shah to return.
Although the students were followers of the Islamic belief, the Ayatollah had no part in this plan. On November 4th, 1979, around 6:30 a.m., about 300 students, all part of the Muslim Student Followers, gathered at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran.
The whole streets just unloaded into the American embassy.
Once they were inside the gates, the U.S. Marine Guards were outnumbered and dashed inside to destroy important documents.
There were 12 of us destroying classified material. We held out, the 12 of us did, for approximately 2.5 extra hours.
Once the 66 hostages were blindfolded and handcuffed, they were placed in front of cameras to get the point out to the world that hostages were taken, and Iran wanted the Shah back.
He was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm him.
Once the hostages were taken, the United States immediately put diplomatic pressure on Iran in order to release the hostages. On November 12th, President Jimmy Carter ended all oil imports from Iran. He also froze all of Iran's assets in the US, which totaled about $8 billion. Many Iranians in the United States political environment were expelled. However, these diplomatic pressures failed to have an effect on Iran because there was other countries they could sell their oil to, and they weren't dependent on their assets in the United States. Former Vice President Walter Mondale said, "We tried everything we could think of to obtain the return of our hostages. In the early moments, we talked to some of the leaders of the new government, most of whom were taken out of office. As a result, we worked through the special interest section in the Swiss embassy in Tehran. We started more traditional diplomatic channels around the world. None of this did any good." After many failed attempts at a diplomatic solution, President Carter resorted to military action. He approved Mission Eagle Claw to rescue the hostages. On the night of April 24th, 1980, a number of transport planes met with 8 helicopters at airstrip Desert 1 in Iran.
As our team was withdrawing after my order to do so, 2 of our American aircraft collided on the ground following a refueling operation in a remote desert location in Iran. 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed, and several other Americans were hurt in the accident.
But those 8 men, they perished so that we might have had a chance to have been freed early.
In mid-November, the Ayatollah released 13 hostages, and the 14 would be released 8 months later. The remaining 52 hostages would be held for the next 444 days. On July 27, 1980, the Shah of Iran died of lymphatic cancer in Cairo, Egypt. The Shah's death made Iran more open for negotiations. During the next few months, the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria acted as a diplomatic communication between Iran and the United States. The 2 sides came to a compromise by signing a treaty called the Algiers Accords, which gave both sides what they wanted. The Algiers Accords was a treaty stating that the United States would unfreeze all of Iran's $8 billion in assets. It also said the U.S. was not allowed to interfere with Iran's internal affairs. The countries would end lawsuits against each other, and all Iranian debt to the U.S. would be paid. On January 19th, Iran and the United States agreed to the compromise and signed the agreement. On January 20th, 1981, shortly after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, the hostages were released.
Good evening. 41 minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as this country's 40th president, the American hostages in Iran began their flight to freedom.
The American people really went out of their way to remember all of us and didn't forget us while we were there.